Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our attendees joining us today for this latest Data Science Central webinar. This is Bill Voorhees, your host. I'm the editorial director with Data Science Central and also chief data scientist for Data Magnum. I'd like to start off our event today by thanking Tableau for sponsoring today's event. Tableau is a longtime supporter of the Data Science Central community, and we're honored to have them sponsoring our event today. I'd also like to take this opportunity to mention and show our appreciation for some of our other recent sponsors, including SAS, IBM, Qlik, Databricks, and SAP, to name just a few. Now, past webinars are available on demand at datasciencecentral.com, and if you haven't had the opportunity to view them, I encourage you to take a look. They provide some very useful insight into a wide variety of topics of interest to our data science community. Now, today's webinar is entitled Data Viz, Painting a Truthful Point of View, and that's going to be presented by Tableau. Now, before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format for today's webinar. Today's event will be an hour long. We have one presenter who I'll introduce in just a minute. There'll be 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A following the presentation, and this event is being recorded and will be available on datasciencecentral.com later this afternoon following today's live event. Now, I'd also like to encourage our attendees to provide questions throughout the presentation, so we'll be reviewing and presenting them on your behalf during the Q&A portion of today's event. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker, Jeff Pettiross with Tableau. Jeff is Senior Manager for User Experience Design at Tableau. Jeff's been dreaming about information design and user experience since he was a kid, spending hours sketching out interface elements for games he'd write on his TRS-80. Since then, he's spent the last 25 years designing software and information visualizations in diverse fields including data analysis and visualization, healthcare, project management, desktop software, and engineering. So as the leader of Tableau's user experience design team, he races to keep up with the great ideas about design and viz generated by the rest of Tableau. So Jeff, hey, thanks for being with us today. We're looking forward to your presentation. Now, we all know that data doesn't lie. However, when we create visualizations, we may at times stretch the truth. And this is often done to help others realize the true story, or at least the truth as it's been revealed to us through the data. So what are the implications of that? And how do we approach data visualization ethically? Another important point is that data is not just facts. And though data visualization, it is our next best creative medium. So in today's Data Science Central live webinar, Jeff Pettiross of Tableau will explore the parallel history of painting and data, studying their emergence as creative fields, and then ground that theory with tools and techniques to visualize and present data both creatively and truthfully. So Jeff, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you. You can begin as soon as you're ready to go.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Very kind introduction. I think that we all want to be heroes, right? I mean, not just at work, but like real-life action heroes. Imagine Tom Cruise bursting through your office door. His clothes are dirty and torn, and there's a bit of blood on his face that tells you he's been through hell. He looks around desperately, yelling, "Does anyone here know how to make a beautiful chart?" Well, that hasn't happened to me yet. And though I expect most of us don't deal with Hollywood-scale crises, we do work in a field that operates at a truly stunning scale, the global scale of data. So as Bill mentioned, I'm Jeff, and I lead the user experience design team here at Tableau. You know, when I was a kid, I did program on my TRS-80, and at the time it had 4 whole kilobytes of RAM. I think data was a lot smaller then. Now, if we fast forward to 1996, when I helped found a software company, back then, flannel was stylish for the first time. I had more hair, as you can see from the hair here. And the Macarena was popular everywhere, not just at wedding receptions. At the time, we also released our software on these things. Nearly 3 megabytes fit on one floppy disk. The largest hard disk at the time was 8 gigabytes. A few years later, around the turn of the century, it took a multi-million-dollar data center to hold 1,000 times that amount. In a Seattle neighborhood, I was at a startup that had a wall of computers and a sophisticated robotic tape backup system that could hold 10 terabytes. Today, 15 later than that, $500 will buy a hard drive that stores 10 terabytes. By 2025, there will be 44 zettabytes, 44 billion terabytes of digital data created, according to IDC. Now, of course, a lot of us have heard these stories about the sheer scope of data in the world, and it's kind of breathtaking and part of what makes our field so exciting. Yet, we in this field claim to have the skills and technology to make sense of it. But how do we really get to the truth of the data? And more importantly, to have an impact on other people. Because if we show them the data and it's meaningless to them, have we actually moved them? Have we actually changed the world? So I think we can learn from another medium that's been touching people for far longer, paintings. Now, Paleolithic art has been found all around the world. Some pieces are estimated to be 30,000 years old. This one is a little bit younger than that. This is one of the pieces from the famous Lascaux caves in France. And without diminishing the beauty or importance of some of the first known artistic expression, you can see there are just a couple of colors used. The imagery is simple, and all the figures are in a single plane. There's no sense of perspective that's been developed yet. Now, about 4,000 years ago, artist tools, you can see, have advanced, allowing for more accurate representation. The colors are, more meaningful, but the images are hardly realistic. Human figures are sized actually based on their importance, and their bodies have the stylized presentation where the torsos are facing forward and the heads are turned sideways. And you may even notice those are words filling the frame around the art, describing how a priest and his wife are beseeching Osiris to sustain them after death. So it's a lot like good data viz today, captions telling the story of the picture. Now, around another 1,300 years later, around the 5th century before the Common Era, the Greeks began the work to understand perspective. They tried lots of ideas. It's not like people didn't realize that things that are far away look smaller. But another 1,000 years from that passed as artists and philosophers struggled to make more accurate images. Ideas spread and were developed independently in Europe and Asia. One approach was oblique perspective, like this. It's a Song Dynasty watercolor of a watermill from the 12th century of the current era. This technique was used in Rome, India, Korea, and Japan, among other places, for centuries. The vanishing points of linear perspective aren't anywhere to be seen, at least not until the 14th century. In the 14th century, some artists began to use linear perspective, but it was Filippo Brunelleschi in the early 15th century who came up with the killer demo, if you will. It involved a mirror, a canvas with an eye hole cut into it, and the soon-to-be-completed Duomo di Firenze. Brunelleschi popularized the vanishing points we all learned in grade school by basically showing how his painting was a picture of a certain hallway in the Duomo, and then when he took away a mirror, you could actually see the Duomo itself and how it matched to his drawing. And so once he taught everyone this idea of a vanishing point, the idea spread like wildfire. By the late 15th century, Italian Renaissance artists commonly used perspective, like Botticelli here in his Annunciazione. At the same time as this was happening, madder red and indigo, lead white and ultramarine were broadening the palette of colors for the rest of time. This trend of increased realism at the cutting edge of art continued until the 19th century. Here we see in Fin du Travail by Jules Breton perspective and realistic images of ordinary people and brilliant colors. So finally, after we spent 30,000 years striving to figure out how to make things look real, paintings finally achieved that visual realism. But Then a group of rebels in Paris threw away that hard-won victory. The Impressionists took art back to the streets. They worked outside instead of working in a studio. They decided they didn't need to perfectly capture images, and instead, they sort of gestured in the direction of truth, if you will. And yet, there is something vibrant and alive suggested here by Monet's Impression Soleil Levant, which he painted in 1872. Despite the obvious presence of brushstrokes, we see light and movement and people. So even as artists had worked all this time to make the brushstrokes seem smaller and less relevant, now it becomes an important part of the art itself. And then in the 20th century, things took another turn entirely. Cubism broke the fourth wall of the canvas, allowing us to see multiple perspectives at the same time of the same view. After we took millennia to figure out perspective, the Cubists broke the tools and just used what they wanted from them. Cubism blew the modern art world open and ushered in an era of diversity and creativity. But in all this art, there's still a thread of the truth, no matter that it's no longer representational. So when Robert Delaunay painted La Vie numéro 2, this painting here in 1910, he retained a sense of the light. He retained a concrete subject, a town. He harkens back to Impressionism with bits of color, creating an overall effect of brilliance. So the Cubists had all the tools of what came before them: breathtaking pigments, accurate projection of 3 dimensions onto 2, theory of color perception. They just chose what parts they wanted to use. Of course, one of the most famous Cubists was Pablo Picasso. And he said, "In my opinion, to search means nothing in painting. To find is the thing." We all know that art is not truth. Art is a lie that makes us realize truth, at least the truth that is given us to understand. The artist must know the manner whereby to convince others of the truthfulness of their lies. But I can fairly hear you cry, data is not a lie. I agree 100% once we set aside things like collection bias, faulty instrumentation, and other errors. But even if we had accurate and fair data, I want to suggest that data and visualization are following the same trajectory as art and painting, and we have an opportunity to learn from that medium. So let's take a look at some data history. Now, I doubt that cave painters kept a crosstab of the number of bison they were eating, but the ancient Egyptians did do accounting. This is an ancient ledger, one of the oldest preserved spreadsheets, if you can believe it, and it was originally a month-long inventory of deliveries. Then around the 1st century of the current era, the Quechua, living in what's now the South American Andes, kept ledgers in a different format with knotted strings called quipus. This was part of the communication system that allowed the Inca Empire to control much of the Andes throughout the 1500s. Now, if any of you have ever run your own business, you will not be surprised to find out that the Middle Ages, in addition to sponsoring the invention of torture devices like the rack and the Iron Maiden, also led to the creation of double-entry bookkeeping. But it's still just a collection of numbers, organized into rows and columns, digits and grid lines. The content really had not evolved much in the few thousand years between the papyrus we saw and this book. And ledgers continued not to change significantly until 1979. That was the year that Bob Frankston and Dan Bricklin introduced VisiCalc to the world. It was the killer app for the Apple II, single-handedly turning the microcomputer from a hobbyist pastime to a serious business tool. VisiCalc eventually sold 1 million copies, making it the first way to digitize mass-market data. VisiCalc eventually gave way to Lotus 1-2-3, which was subsequently toppled by Microsoft Excel. And joining the ranks of these end-user tools, we saw databases evolve, growing from floppy disk storage through hard disks to petabyte-scale cloud implementations that we have today. With all this data around, there's just one simple truth. There is far more data than we could ever hope to use, and we just keep making more. So I'd like to give an example of this. This is an example of a stunning scale of data. This is imagery from a Saturday afternoon just before Hurricane Nate was going to strike Louisiana. Here we see millions of points of data as wind speeds and coastal geography dance together. And yet, despite the huge amount of data here, so much is omitted. This is just one category of weather data, the wind. It's cropped to show just a part of the globe. I picked a time that would show an interesting feature, but the wind above the surface is eliminated. It's aggregated down to about 1.5 million pixels. And then those pixels were compressed further by the MPEG video format where I originally grabbed this, and again down to JPEG and whatever is happening to it as it comes from me to you across the internet. The color just approximates the speed of the wind, and on and on. So to draw a parallel to painting, data realism simply isn't the most attractive option anymore. And so just like the Impressionists and the Modernists, we have the chance to do something revolutionary. So data might not lie, but every time we make a viz, we lie to others so that they can realize truth, at least the truth that is ours to understand. I'd like you to take a moment to think about a recent viz you made or used and maybe reflect on how that viz could have told a lie of some kind. But while you're thinking about that, I'm going to move on from theory. And let's talk about how we can actually apply some techniques of visualization to lie creatively with data. So the first tool I'd like to present is the idea to get rid of everything you don't need. So we can do things like filter, which removes some data, and aggregate, which simplifies our data. We can even do things like choose what we're going to publish. You know, I used to be a radio news reporter, and during morning drive newscast, we had time for 5 stories. Now, this was rural upstate New York, but still news was going on. And sometimes story number 6 was just as relevant as story number 5, but didn't make it on the air. We're always choosing something to leave out. So even when we try to represent a single number perfectly, we end up rounding giant numbers to some smaller number of pixels. I'd like to share a quote from Dr. Dan Ariely. He talked about PSA, prostate-specific antigen, one of the key health markers for a 50-year-old man. And what he said, this is a bit of the quote here, but I want to read the fuller quote to you. He says, I talked to some oncologists about PSA. It's a very, very noisy measure. Let's say your number is 3.04, and one day it goes up to 3.1. And you know, that's meaningless. The standard deviation is 1. It's a meaningless change, and nobody can tell you anything from it, but it's so clear. And it sits there on the form, and it has decimals, and it's hard for people to ignore it. This notion of digital measurement, we have more and more accurate measurements, and it's true they are more accurate at that moment. But because we don't understand randomness and variance so well, we over-extrapolate from those measurements. So that's the end of his quote. And I want to be clear, it's not that we don't intellectually understand randomness or variance, but we have cognitive biases in processing information. Sometimes it's not that the data is too big, but it's just too deep. For example, here at Tableau, as at many software companies, we closely track the number of defects we see in our products before we release them. Of course, just like all software companies, our products have no defects when they go out the door. But sometimes we want to track each of them minute to minute, like when it's getting close to a release, and we want to know exactly what's going on. But when we step back and take a look at trends to figure out how to do our work better next year or next quarter, we want to lose that detail of a minute-by-minute update on purpose. So getting rid of everything we don't need isn't just about filtering, but also identifying the right level of detail to tell our story. So I'd like to share a picture. This one here is from Skylar Johnson. He made this chart showing when and how every spell was muttered, flicked, and yelled in the Harry Potter universe, in the books in particular. Now, this was published on Tableau Public about a year and a half ago. And this distillation of Harry Potter has now been viewed more than 410,000 times. And it was not only covered in Mashable, but also by the websites for Glamour, Teen Vogue, and Cosmo. Now, while a realist with data might have transcribed the text, Schuyler instead took an impressionist angle, if you will. He invited all of us to relive one of our favorite stories from a new perspective, only gesturing at the shared understanding of the reality underneath. And if you've read the stories or even seen the movies, you can follow the arc of them just by noticing which spells were cast when. So by taking away the elements that were not important to his story, and by adding a sense of beauty to the image, Schuyler transformed the data into something fresh and interesting. He told, if you will, a new story. But what if he had striven for completeness instead? He could have taken the exact same data and made a crosstab report out of Harry Potter. It's certainly more complete, but the understandability of what he was trying to tell has been drained away. This is why spreadsheets are often a fundamentally broken way to understand data, although that level of detail can sometimes be useful. I've got an example of that in a little bit. But often using spreadsheets to understand data is like reading code to run an app. So let's try something else with this data, maybe a bar chart. Well, now at least the information is a little bit more understandable. By making bars that count the number of times a spell was cast and sorting them from biggest to smallest, I get a sense of the most frequently uttered spells, even if I don't get the context of when they were cast. But it's not particularly engaging. Charts without beauty inform, but don't engage. This is not something that captures the imagination, something that inspires people to pick it up and share it and explore the nooks and crannies. But when we return to the original work and bring a sense of design to it, like Schuyler did, the color and texture of the stories comes more to life. He draws us in a completely different way. Our creative skills make data and beauty build on each other. There's a virtuous feedback loop here. Let's look at some other examples of how data can inspire beauty and how beauty can inspire data. Tide charts. They're a necessity for navigation. If I were a ship captain in the San Francisco Bay, I would need this detail, but they hardly capture the imagination. These numbers represent the physical movement of tons of water, a dynamic heartbeat of the aquatic world at the interface between ocean and sky, if you'll allow me a moment of drama. Now, at the Exploratorium, a science museum in San Francisco, and if any of you are listening from the Bay Area, I can't encourage you to go there enough, they have a piece called Tidal Memory. It sits in a room looking north out over the San Francisco Bay. Each day, it shows the actual level of the tide outside with one column of water per hour. Here, we're invited to see the weight of the water, to walk around it, and to be surrounded by its movement. Out of a literal ocean of data, they chose 24 measurements and brought them to life. This picture is from the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C. Over 5,000 student earthquake victims were found by the Citizens Investigation following an earthquake in Sichuan, China in 2008. Parents and activists claim many of these deaths were due to substandard building practices. Chinese artist and activist Ai Weiwei collected these names and published them on the internet in this art exhibition, and also as a 3-hour, 41-minute recording of all the names being read. In this instance, all the details in one place are part of the magnitude of the story being told, more powerfully than a chart or graph. And if you're ever wondering about the impact of data being presented artfully, in May 2009, the year after the quake, in a fairly unprecedented move, without admitting anything about the construction of the schools, the Chinese government did say that 5,335 students were killed in the quake. So Monet focused on the most important elements here: the sun, reflection on water, people in the boats. Out of all the sights and sounds and smells of Paris in that moment, he picked a few things to bring us to that foggy, cool morning. So what do we need to do to find the most salient elements of our data and focus on them. We just need to get rid of everything we don't need. So the second thing I'd like to talk about, you may have heard things about the psychology of perception, and we at Tableau are pretty proud of our defaults that build decent visualizations. But let's take a look at some inspiration of how we can go beyond mere colors and circles and do something more creative with our data. I'd like to start with this here, Dear Data, or Dear Data. Without any software tools, Georgia Lupi and Stephanie Posavec created this very personal, beautiful project. For 52 weeks, they decided to capture something about their lives, and each week they would capture the same thing. They would hand draw a postcard visualizing their week and mail it across the Atlantic to each other. In this case, in this week, they both captured laughter. And they put all these postcards, by the way, in a book called Dear Data, something else I can't recommend enough. Now, a simple histogram or line chart could have conveyed the same data about laughter, but here, George's laughter blooms on the page, and Stephanie's pop, pop, pops. They've captured the ephemeral nature of a moment of joy big enough that it makes a sound. Color can have a huge impact, too. Here we've got two vises. The original is on the left, with dark red dripping down, suggestive of blood. And then a colleague of mine, Andy Cotgrave, did the version on the right. And if you look closely, you can see it's the exact same visualization, just flipped upside down, and its colors changed. So instead of telling the story possibly about how many people have died, he's telling a story about the progress and how many fewer people are dying, without sugarcoating what's going on either. So we've looked a little bit about how color and creativity might inspire us. What I'd like to do now is take a look at how we might be able to use this in data visualizations. And I've got a story I want to tell a little bit about business licenses in Las Vegas, of all things. And if you'll pardon me, I'm going to spend a moment and look at Tableau together. But what I'm going to do is, while I'm talking about Tableau, is share techniques and ideas that would really work no matter what tools you use. So here we see a scatter plot of businesses and canceled licenses in Las Vegas. And across the x-axis at the bottom, we can see a distinct count of business names. In other words, to the right is more businesses. And if we go up, we see there are a number of canceled licenses. Now, most of the data points fall along something of a line. We can see some correlation. We can see that these 3 points out here are ones that seem to have a larger number of businesses, but a correspondingly larger number of canceled licenses. And then out here, we've got this one outlier. And if we look at it, it's for alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana. For some reason, this kind of business seems to inspire a lot more canceled licenses. Well, this certainly gets at the data. It tells the story a little bit. But let's think about how we could get more creative in telling this story. So how can we pull people into what might be more interesting here? Well, one thing we could do is with imagery. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my browser. And what I'm going to do is go to a website called Pixabay. And about Pixabay, what you'll see is it's actually free stock photography. I think many of us have been to stock photography sites before. But what's nice about Pixabay is that there's no cost to this. So instead of having to do digging through Google image searches and picking something that's probably actually copyrighted, we can come to a site like Pixabay and find something. So if I type in Las Vegas and search for that, because I want to tell a story about Las Vegas, I can see a beautiful collection of images. I'll scroll through a few, and as I do this, what I'm looking for is to use the sense of design to find something that would have a nice canvas in which to tell the story. So there's a stretch of sky in some of these. That might be an interesting place to put a data viz. But I want to look for something that doesn't have noise in the background, distracting from the data. I don't see any great options here, so I'm going to go to another site that I want to share with you. This one's called Unsplash. So the first one is Pixabay, Pixabay.com, and this is unsplash.com. So again, I'm going to search for Las Vegas. And as I type it, it'll search, and then I can see, well, here's one of the famous sign in Las Vegas. That might not be a bad one. If I scroll down a little bit more, I can see, oh, here's a great one of the Las Vegas skyline at night. This large, dark area here. It's kind of nice because we're talking about canceled businesses, and night has a suggestion of ending and closure. And the big space there gives me a place to put my data. And there's not a lot of other high-frequency information in this picture, not a lot of things to really conflict with the data. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and download this image. And you'll see here on Unsplash, they say crediting isn't required, but it is appreciated. And as we keep going through some of these more creative notes, I'd like to think about how we can be ethical in our usage of this information. So I can come back to Tableau and insert it. What I'd like to do first, though, is figure out what are some of the colors that I might use in my viz that I can draw from this. I've got this beautiful picture, so why would I want to use a standard palette of colors when I want to highlight what's going on in the visualization? Because color is another powerful way to enhance our story. So let's go take a look at this tool I'd like to share, called Adobe Color. It used to be called Cooler. You might have heard of that. And what it does is it allows you to assemble a palette of colors. But when I click on this photo tool up here in the top right, it'll let me open a file from my computer, and I'm going to pick that Las Vegas Valley that I've already downloaded. Here we can see the image, and Adobe Color has already picked out some colors that are sort of representative of the image. What I can do is grab one of these circles and look for the colors that will help me tell my story. Now, I'm building a data visualization on a dark background, so I want to look for some of the lighter colors. So as wonderfully cool as those dark colors are, I could, for instance, drag this circle here, and maybe I want to grab some of these bright city lights because that's nice and emblematic of Las Vegas. Or I could grab this one here, and there's some beautiful greens down here. Maybe I can grab one of these pixels. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you get the idea how you can use this to pull colors out. And what's nice about this is that in lots of software today, you can use eyedroppers to pick these colors up and put them in our tools. So I'm going to go back to Tableau now. And when I do that, we're going to see that I've picked up that picture and started using some of the colors as well. All right, here's Tableau again. Here's the picture. I've loaded it in. And then I'm going to take that scatter plot and add it to there. I've changed some of the colors as well, and so far I've kept Tableau's default blue. And what I really want to do is there are three distinct parts of this viz, as I mentioned before. There are sort of a number of lower frequency businesses down in the lower left. There are these three kinds of businesses out here: professional services, housing and lodging, and retail, that are a higher volume in Las Vegas. That makes sense. And then there's this outlier up here, alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana, which have a much larger number of cancellations for the number of businesses. So I'm going to assign different colors for each of those three different groups. I'm not going to walk through all the individual steps in Tableau, but I'll do a little bit of a Julia Childs move, and there it is, all finished for us. So here now we're looking at these three sections. Now the color's done something to tell our story. The picture does something to give us a sense of place. But finally, I'd like to help tell this story by using shapes that go along with what each group means. And to do that, what I'd like to do is go to one last online resource, the Noun Project. What I particularly like about the Noun Project is that it gives us ways to pull together icons that will help us tell our story. So the Noun Project is at thenounproject.com, and here's what it looks like. And so, for instance, if I search for something like service, because that's one of the industries I saw in Las Vegas, I'll type service and press enter, and I see a lot of icons. One thing I'd like to call out about this is start to think about bias in how we're starting to tell our stories. As I look at all these service-oriented icons, if I were to believe Noun Project's perspective of the world, I have to go through quite a bit before I even see one woman who's working in a service industry. There are many helpful men all over the place. Oh, here's someone even wearing overalls. It's about 4 or 5 screens down before I see my first woman. So as we're telling our stories, we want to be careful about how we're telling them. As we add new images, what are we doing to change perspective on the story? Another example is, if you remember, that one point was about alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana. Well, I could try to tell a dramatic story about marijuana, perhaps, and go find a marijuana leaf and put it in there. But as it turns out, that may not be a great choice, because alcohol is the largest number of those businesses. So while marijuana might be a political lightning rod, it doesn't tell the story accurately. But let me go ahead and pick one of these icons now. Let's say I wanted to use this one for service. So what I can do is Now click Download, and it gives me two choices, PNG or SVG. Depending on which tool you use, these are two different file formats. PNG is a bitmap format, and SVG is a vector graphics format. I won't go into the details of what that is, but for Tableau, PNGs work better, so I'm going to start there. And here are two choices it's going to give me. One of them is royalty-free, which may be a little bit ironically named if you're not familiar with what royalty-free is. Royalty-free means that I pay for this once, and then I can use it again as many times as I want. Creative Commons, on the other hand, is truly free, but it does mean that I need to give credit to the author when I do it. So if I were to download Creative Commons, for example, I get an image, and if I were to open it, it's going to tell me something about who it is so I can give her proper credit in this case. So now what's happened is I've taken some icons, taken some color, we've added this all on top of an image, and when we put it all together, we get something that still has the exact same data as that original story. It still tells us about businesses in Las Vegas and what's been closed and not. But when you see the final picture, it tells it in a slightly more compelling way. We can see that one purple icon stands out there, and we can see without even needing to point at it or see a tooltip that it's something probably to do with alcohol or drinking. And we can get an idea of the breadth of industries in Las Vegas. Those icons in the bottom right are also suggestive of Las Vegas, right? I see shopping. I see a bed, which says it's probably something about lodging. And, well, the dialogue going on in the bottom right is a little hard to understand what it is, but I can hover over it and see that it's service. Now, what else I've done, to come back to the ethics of this again, is I've added some text to explain it. But below the text, you'll also see that I've said where the data is from. I've given a link back to the source and listed the name of every single artist that's contributed to this, including both the person who took the photograph in the background and each person who created each of those icons. And I really wanted to do this here to point out it may seem like a lot, but taken in the context of everything else going on the screen, it's really a pretty minor part of the information. And we can use things like typography and color to help that fall to the back without necessarily betraying the need to credit the artist appropriately. So if we are going to get creative about choosing colors like this, what we also need to do is keep in mind people who can't necessarily see colors. Now, a lot of good data visualization tools will suggest palettes or offer palettes that are optimized well for people with color vision deficiency. Why is this important? Well, about 10% of men have some amount of color vision deficiency and a smaller number of women. There are a number of tools that help do this, but the one I would like to recommend is one called Color Oracle. The reason why I like Color Oracle so much is that it you run it on your computer and you can turn it on for any moment on your screen and see what it is. So I'm not going to demonstrate it here because it's not going to work terribly well over the screen share, but I will go to the website so you get an idea of what it looks like and you know you've come to the right place. So Color Oracle is a free tool that lets you simulate 3 different kinds of color blindness on Windows, Mac, and Linux, as it says here. So if you run it on your Mac, it'll show up in your menu bar. If you run it on Windows, it'll show up down in the lower right corner of your screen in the notification area, and it'll let you simulate different kinds of color vision deficiency. So one final thing I'd like to point out is also about if you don't want to just do categorical color, you might want to start with a color palette that works well. So I'm going to take you to Color Brewer. Color Brewer is developed by Cynthia Brewer and her team of color scientists. And what it does is it lets you create new kinds of color palettes for quantitative color. In addition to explicitly supporting things like, as they call it here, colorblind safe, or as I would say, CVD-friendly palettes, you can also create palettes that are things like print-friendly and photocopy safe, in case you're in a place of business where you still often print or make photocopies of things. So this is a whole bunch of tools I wanted to throw out as ways to inspire more creativity, things that we can do to add more to our data visualization to tell stories in bolder and brighter ways. So, with all that in mind, remember we don't need to be trained fine artists to tell data stories with images and color and shapes. Sometimes simpler can be even better. That's why I love this bison that was in a cave painting. Even though the drawing itself is pretty simple, it really has immediacy and impact. And as a friend of mine here at Tableau says, being creative is a practice. It's something that we do over and over. It's not something that we just do once perfectly. So with that in mind, I hope to encourage all of us to be a little bit bold with how we apply creativity. And, we'll make some missteps, but I think we'll all get better in our practice and our art as we do that. So again, go beyond just colors and circles. See how you can go extend the canvas of what you're working on. That brings me to the third point I wanted to make. We can sometimes make up what's missing. A friend of mine here, Zach Woodall, said once, "The data is not all in the data. Sometimes the data is in your head." And what do you mean by that? I thought it was a rather provocative statement. And what he was talking about is that sometimes we know something about the information that's at hand that just isn't in a spreadsheet yet. Geography is a great example of a place where we tell kind of certain lies all the time in order to make more sense of data. So 2D maps, for example, two-dimensional maps, are all projections of a squashed sphere onto a plane. In data visualization, we usually use something like this, which is a Mercator projection. The reason we do that is it's great for latitude and longitude, but it's not so great for places like Greenland, which looks huge, for example, because it's far away from the equator. Well, that's what Texas looks like, and it turns out Greenland is about 3 times the size of Texas. So if you could pick up and move Texas on top of Greenland, it should take only 3 Texases to cover it. So there's clearly something inaccurate in this drawing. Now, there are similar issues in geography in lots of different ways. For example, the amount of political power the Senate has in the United States. Any map projection will make a tiny state like Rhode Island look teeny and Texas look huge. But in the Senate, they carry equal weight, for example. So we could look at a different map, like this hex map here. We have often seen things like this in the news. By remapping the states into a hex grid or squares or some other shape, we can keep the idea of the geography. We can gesture in the direction of it, but we more accurately represent the relative political power of each state in the upper house of the Congress. And here's another example I wanted to share. This one's of the United Kingdom. Despite the UK's unwillingness to fit beautifully onto a widescreen display, I still wanted to include this more complicated hex map that The Guardian has made for covering United Kingdom elections. Each voting region here is a collection of hex shapes in this map. And what's happened is we've actually added data in both these examples. We've made up where the states sit. The Guardian made up the shape of each of those voting regions in the UK. So we add data, and anytime there seems to be some meaning missing from the data or something that is ripe for misinterpretation, like a map projection. So for example, if you're building a viz about causes of premature death, you could add up the years lost to the causes and include that as part of the visualization, even though it's clearly not part of the original data. A fourth idea I wanted to share is to get random. Sometimes we need to mix it up a little bit. The pointillists, I think, had the right idea here. Sometimes a bit of noise in the picture makes for something more nuanced and delightful. So, for example, Georges Seurat painted Un dimanche après-midi à l'île de la Grande Jatte. Many people have seen this painting, I suspect. But rather than directly painting a color, Seurat used points of other colors to create texture and stimulate a different way of perceiving the lights and shadows. He used bright swatches in some of the sunny areas, which tricks our brains into thinking there's actual light on the painting. Now, we can draw on this idea a little bit, if you will, with data. We can scatter related points to find something more subtle, and this technique is called jittering. So, for example, imagine I'm a sales manager, and I want to look for the seasonality of discounts that my sales team uses. Here's a viz that does get at what the sales data is. Each month is represented by one column, and the amount of discount is represented by the vertical axis. But I can't really see seasonality, whether it exists in this data or not. But if I were to take, and part of the reason is that each discount is a fixed, it tends to happen at discrete quanta. Right? My discounts all tend to happen at similar numbers, 15%, 20%, and so on. But if I were to jitter the data, to use some randomness to spread out the points within a month, then I get new information showing up. And I can see that there is seasonality to the data here. I can see that more happens in September later in the year, and a lot of the discounts seem to happen around the same level. All things that were lost when it was so heavily overplotted in that simpler scatter plot. And then I want to wrap up with just one more point. I mentioned this before, but when we're painting with data, we're choosing to engage in creativity with the information. And so it's important that we be ethical and we do right with data. Remember, data often represents people. It's not just the artist that might create things like icons that we include or paintings we'd use as a background. But it's really important we make sure our sources are complete. And we're also appropriately preserving the anonymity of the people that are in the data. And I'd like to illustrate this with a quick story. In 1928, in Muncie, Indiana, a couple of ethnographers, the Linns, embedded themselves in Muncie for a year. And they took data because what they wanted to do was tell the story of a middle American town, a very typical town. They saw that we're using ethnography to study people in other cultures, but what about right here at home? And when they finished their study, they published this book called Middletown. And it was heralded at the time for its completeness. Unfortunately, what they did not mention when they wrote their book, or they did mention it, but it's kind of lost, is that they decided to omit everyone who was not white from the data because they made the analysis of the information more complicated. Literally, they called them complications excluded from the data. I don't think that the Linns were actually trying to be racist. As a matter of fact, if you trace their politics and some of the movements they were involved with, it suggests they were just the opposite. And simply in their pursuit of what they thought was getting more effective data out, they omitted a large part of our population. Now, we also shouldn't use visualization techniques that intentionally distort the data. Nathan Yao, in his blog at flowingdata.com, has an entire article on this, which is lovely. You can do a search for flowing data and visualization live, and it will come up. And here's one example that he gave. The two graphs theoretically are generated from the same numbers, talking about the length of each bar representing weight over time. But of course, in the top one, it's more accurate. You see the small variances in weight over time, but in the bottom one, the volume of the bars, the area of the bars rather, doesn't accurately represent the weights anymore. We've lost that information. Finally, we don't want to add or imply meaning that's not there. I mentioned this briefly before. I could have chosen to use marijuana leaves to represent alcohol, tobacco, and marijuana in that Las Vegas data and the canceled businesses, maybe to make a point about how marijuana is bad for the state's economy or something. But if we dig a little bit further into the data, we can see that these four highlighted kinds of business licenses are all the marijuana-related businesses in Las Vegas. And the top few there, alcohol, beverage center, tobacco dealer, and tavern, and so forth, are all about alcohol and tobacco. So they're a much bigger contributor here. So we need to be careful when we're adding meaning that we're not implying meaning that's not really in the data to begin with. And I already talked about giving credit where it's appropriate. So I want to close with just one final bit of inspiration. Marcin Ignatz runs a studio called Variable in London. He writes code using tools like processing to make art that's generated from data. So for example, this here is 7 days of exercise data captured from one of Nike's fitness gadgets. He actually did this as a commissioned work for Nike that was shown for a while at a very large scale in one of their buildings. Each string here represents a day, and the curve and color and width of each fiber represents the time, intensity, and duration of exercise over those days. Now, this visualization is more art than data, but still gestures in the direction of facts. And for me, it gets to what we try to do with the beauty and power of our exercises and data visualization. I love looking at this because it inspires me to get more creativity when I work with data. So as we together stand on the shores of this virtual ocean of data that we are creating around us, we have an obligation to communicate the truth. And I think the most powerful way to do that is to follow in the footsteps of the artists who have come before us, those that tell lies that make us all realize the truth. Thank you for your time, and I'm going to pass it back to Bill to moderate our question and answer session.
Well, Jeff, thank you for that excellent presentation. We'll get started with today's Q&A session, and I want to thank the audience for their participation. We've had a lot of questions that have come in during the presentation, so we'll do our best to get through all of them in the time remaining. So during this Q&A session, I'll leave up this screen with contact information for Jeff in case you'd like to get a hold of him following today's webinar. So let's get started. Jeff, I thought that the examples from Nathan Yao and the Lins were very enlightening, and I guess it brings up the issue, it's hard to avoid mistakes we don't even see. Is there a way that we can avoid unconscious bias when we're doing data viz?
Sure, that's a great question. There are some things we can do, and unconscious bias is a funny beast because, as the very name says, it's unconscious. So it's not like something we can actually see in front of us and choose to remove. It's noticing what's not there in the negative space. But there are some practices we can use, and it's more about cultivating them in our day-to-day life rather than necessarily going back and just thinking harder about what we're doing. So I've got 4 concrete tips about how to avoid unconscious bias. One, you want to review your work with a diverse audience. I think we all get in the rut of thinking about the people with whom we work every day and the people with whom we're most comfortable getting feedback. So how can we bust out of that? People, I can't think of anyone who's not, while they may be busy, no one is offended when you ask for their opinion. So how can we reach out to people we don't usually reach out to, people who don't have a similar background to us, and get their ideas about what we're doing, and be willing to be a little bit vulnerable. We can also do things like find and read works by people from a different background as well, simply by immersing ourselves in cultural concepts that aren't the same thing we grew up with can help us understand the world a little bit better. You can track your results over time. As you talk to people and get their feedback from a wider and wider audience, see if things are getting better. Are you actually improving the feedback you're getting? Is it getting more subtle? And then a 4th idea is to find evidence, actively seek out things that counterbalance our biases. For example, if you've got this idea that maybe you don't want to curry, but this thought in your head that women aren't as good at math as men, go do some research and find 5 women who teach mathematics at university level. Things like that, just to stir up our thoughts a little bit and remind us the world is a little bit bigger than we think it is.
Well, Jeff, thank you. Those are really some excellent tips, and much more broad than I would have imagined. One of our users asks the question that they have users who need to be able to drill down from high level down to the most basic level of the data, the most highly detailed level. When that's the case, is it best to be using a data table, or are there other viz techniques that could work for those folks?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that a lot depends on the context in which you're using the tool as well. One of the most powerful ways to relate different levels of detail of data is to use multiple interrelated views on the screen at the same time, or dashboards as we commonly call them. And so what's nice about that kind of display, if I, for example, had a bar graph or a line graph that was on screen next to some tabular data, I could actually select elements from the bars or the lines and have it highlight or filter what's shown in the table. So it means I keep the context of the information I'm getting, but also able to drill down into some of those finer data points, because sometimes those numbers really do matter. One of the things I get here in my work is I have a team of about 25 designers, and as part of our practice in software development, we try to keep our number of defects that we're each individually responsible for low, and also make sure we aren't letting anything sit on our plates too long. It's just a matter of good hygiene for the entire engineering team where we sit. And every day I get a viz mailed to me that's a lot like that. I get a bar graph that shows me one bar that's colored by the age of each defect sitting on a designer's plate. And then below that I get a table that lists out a little bit more information, the number of the defects in the title, how long it's been to assign to them, and so on. So that pattern is pretty common. Another way to think about it is to explore other ways you can create interactivity in the visualization as well. I showed a little bit in some of the Tableau work how you could point at marks and see tooltips, for example. That's a way you can, even without needing to resort to a table, you can add specific detail about a viz. There are other things like that. But yeah, I don't think data tables are inherently bad. It's just often it's good to be thoughtful about how they're used in context of the rest of the data.
Well, Jeff, I like that idea of using it in combination with a bar chart, from which I presume you would get kind of an instantaneous overview, and then you could look at greater detail in the data table itself. So thank you for that idea. One of our audience members asks about integrating Tableau with Excel, and it's not clear which direction they meant, so let's ask both questions. Importing data from Excel into Tableau and exporting Tableau visuals, say, back into a spreadsheet.
Sure. Yeah, Tableau will go both ways. So you can connect to any Excel file or text file and bring those into Tableau. It's actually one of the first things we did when we launched version 1 14 years ago. And from that, you can build your charts. As a matter of fact, the Las Vegas chart that I had was originally in data in Excel that I saved out to Tableau. And then to get from Tableau back to other places, whether it's Excel or PowerPoint or wherever you want to share it, you can either get the raw data back out, you can export as a crosstab or copy the data back out from Tableau and put it somewhere else, or you can, of course, grab a picture of it, export it as a PDF, or really capture the pixels on the screen to put Tableau visualizations back somewhere else.
Well, Jeff, thanks. And then the other half of that question from our viewer was, well, where can I go to really get a good education on how to use Tableau and how to build things with Tableau?
Sure. Well, one nice thing, if we can toot our own horn a little bit, is our website at tableau.com has a bunch of free training. And when I say a bunch, it's really hundreds of hours of video content, as well as forums, online help, and other ways to learn how to use Tableau. In particular, there's, if you're just trying to get started, there's a great 20-minute video that's right near the top of our help content that just walks you through what it's like even to open an Excel file, bring it in, start doing some drag and drop to build a visualization and get a sense for how the tool works. But our content creation team that works on those, I've never been those people, so even though they're also at Tableau, I'm very happy to toot their horn because they do a wonderful job.
Oh, terrific. Terrific. Thank you for that answer. You focused a lot on the creative aspects of presentation, and so we need to ask, do you have a particular library of books or some specific books that you'd like to recommend that would give us a source of inspiration and kind of jog our creativity?
Sure. Yeah, there's a few that really I've kind of found over the years have worked wonderfully for me. There's a classic set of works by Edward Tufte, starting with a visual display of quantitative information, and then there are 3 sequels to that as well. And while I think that Tufte goes a little bit too far sometimes in his passion for removing ink from the ink, as he calls it, to increase the data to ink ratio, I think that he's still got a lot of really inspiring bits in his work. I still remember in one of his books there's actually a little fold-up pyramid so you can make a 3D image in the middle of the book, and that just really caught my attention for how he wanted to tell his story in a way that you can't do in a typical book. Some other ones, I'm suddenly referring. Stephen Few wrote a book called Show Me the Data. That is a great work for some inspiration. And then Andy Cotgreave, I mentioned him earlier in the context of that bar graph that was both red and upside down, showing the deaths in Iraq, and then Andy redid it as the turquoise right-side-up version, or upside down, however you want to call it. And he and a few of his colleagues just did a book called the Big Book of Dashboards. And in terms of just wanting to have it, if I remember correctly, it's basically a dashboard on every pair of facing pages and talking about how to create it. Not necessarily the steps to how to create it in Tableau, but the ideas that went into it. And it's a really inspiring work when I want to get more ideas how I can put data together.
Well, Jeff, thanks. I must say, big book of dashboards, that sounds like my speed. Thank you so much. Jeff, thanks. Those were some great answers to some very good questions. And for those of you that asked questions today that weren't answered, we'll be sending all the unanswered questions to Jeff and the Tableau team so they can follow up with you after today's webinar. I have just a few quick announcements. If you'd please mark your calendar for January 31st, that's tomorrow. And that's our next DSC webinar, which is going to be Mate Zaharia's prediction for 2018 on big data and AI highlights, and that'll be sponsored by Databricks. Also, remember that today's taping will be available for on-demand viewing later today, and you can find that on the home page of Data Science Central in the Webinar tab, located at the top of the page. Well, this brings today's webinar to a close. I'd like to thank our audience for their attendance and thoughtful questions. A special thanks again to Tableau for their sponsorship, as well as to our speaker today, Jeff Pettiross, for his insight into today's topic. This is Bill Voorhees. I'm very pleased to have been your host for today's event. I look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow, January 31st. Have a great day.